Bedour Alagraa is assistant professor of political and social thought in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. A self-described wayward political theorist, she received her PhD from the Department of African Studies at Brown University in the spring of 2019, where she was the Andrew Mellon Graduate Fellow. She also holds a BA in political science from the University of Toronto and a master's in race, ethnicity, and post-colonial studies from the London School of Economics. More broadly, Dr. Alagraa is interested in Black radical genealogies, in political theory, histories, and histories of political concepts, Caribbean thought, African anti-colonial thought, and Black Marxism, amongst other topics. She has studied and written extensively on the works of Jamaican writer Sylvia Wynter. She's also a member of the editorial team currently editing Wynter's monograph, Black Metamorphosis. Tremendous, tremendous task you are up to here. Dr. Alagraa is also the co-editor of a volume of Chairman Fred Hampton's speeches alongside with Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. titled I Am a Revolutionary, Speeches by Chairman Fred Hampton.
You can skip
First,
over literally all of
all
this.
right,
It's
Doug, you
totally
heard enough
fine.
about yourself. You heard enough. Yeah.
It's on the website. It's
It's on
totally fine.
the website. Without any
Truly.
further delay,
So sorry.
I turn you over to
So
Dr.
sorry.
Bedour Alagraa.
I
Welcome,
didn't.
welcome,
Thank
welcome.
you. I didn't want to be rude. I just wanted to put you out of your misery because I just know how long it is.
I was
So
having listen, we didn't even get to the book, but yes, absolutely.
that's
Please.
literally fine. It will be on the website. I just want to put everybody out of their misery just because it's so long. I'm so sorry. And thank you to Jomo and Zalika for having me here. I'm so excited to participate in this series alongside some fellow friends and comrades who are going to be giving some amazing sessions. I know Dr. Farmer and Dr. Deneau are going to be giving some sessions as well, which I'm very excited for. And today I am going to do my very best to kind of give an intro, but also at the same time delve into some of the finer details of Sylvia Wynter's conceptualization of the third event, which is one of the kind of core organizing principles in her work. Sylvia Wynter is a Cuban-born Jamaican writer, artist, intellectual who has written extensively on Black life in the Americas, specifically as it pertains to our, epistemic codings, the role of culture, right, in launching what she calls these attacks against the profound negations of the Middle Passage and racial slavery. And also, she has an extensive artistic of plays, and she was a dancer and an actor and a critic and all kinds of things. So, whatever it is that you're looking for, Sylvia has probably contributed something deeply profound to uh, that area of thought and study. And so today I'm going to start with a quote from her piece on how we mistook the map for the territory and re-imprisoned ourselves in the unbearableness of being des êtres, which was at the time her kind of one of her more central theses on the state of Black studies post 1960s and 1970s. And in it, she writes the following quote, but they don't want to get to the fundamental issue. Once Fanon has said ontogeny and sociogeny, every discipline you're practicing ceases to exist, end quote, right? But there's also something else that she mentions right at the very beginning of the piece, right? And in it, right, she quotes Amiri Baraka, another artist intellectual, right, who argues that the role of Black arts and logically Black studies and other kind of more radically gazed thought experiments, right, is to exoticize Western thought, right? And what does this mean? It means essentially to make visible the laws whereby, right, we are fixed into certain descriptive statements, right, and governing texts about who we are as Black people, but also we would be able to then unfix the sign of Blackness itself from that very same governing text. So essentially, Amir Baraka is arguing that the role of Black arts, Black studies, and all of these kind of paradigm shifting endeavors is to make Western thought exotic, means to make Western thought strange, uncanny, unfamiliar, right, to our present experience. And not to kind of state the obvious, but Amiri Baraka was from the West, right? So this is somebody who is trying their very best to, on the one hand, from the inside, right, of this governing text, launch a kind of insurrectionary, or as Sylvia would call it, a heretic kind of utterance against this same governing text, right? Now I have a point, I promise. Follow me, all right? So she opens, right, with those kinds of declarations. And what does this have to do with Black studies? Well, in general, the argument that she's making in the piece, right, is that there was a time, right, in the 1960s and early 70s in which Black studies presented what she called a deeply penetrative insight, right, into the conditions of Black people, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, although not excluding especially Africa, right? But these penetrating insights, right, this moment in the sun, as she calls it, right? And in the 2000s, she's reflecting on how we were very much not in that place anymore, right? That Black studies had been significantly defanged, particularly in the 2000s, right? And so she's trying to figure out how is it that we have come to a place in which we mistook the map for the territory, in which we might have mistaken, right? Right. Freedom for representation, perhaps, right? Or, right, the actual act of study for the institution, right, which hosts or authorizes study under a particular epistemic gaze, right? And there are a couple of reasons that she, attributes to this kind of defanging of Black studies. One of those is, right, what she calls the way that middle class ascension was made possible, right, by inclusion in these newly founded Black studies departments. And because of that, we now, for the first time, had a group of radical intellectuals with a new class position who were beginning to slowly turn the project of Black studies towards their newly formed class interests, right? The other reason, right, so institutionalization itself is one reason. The other reason she cites, right, is that Black studies had slowly given into the seduction of discipline itself, right? Suddenly now we have what I like to call the Pinocchio syndrome. I'm a real boy. We're a real discipline. We have a canon, right? We have traditions. We have things that every real discipline should have, right? You have a literary tradition, so do we, right? You have scientists, so do we. You have empirical thinkers, so do we, right? And eventually, we now we're at a point where we were engaging on the terms that were predetermined by the same governing order and the same governing text that we were, right, setting forth to refuse, right? Suddenly now, Western thought was no longer exotic. It was all too familiar and internalized by this new intellectual class, lay intellectual class, right? And so, according to Wynter, the rise of, especially of disciplines, would come to ensure what she calls the maintenance of this kind of master conception of the Western epistemological order, right? And this Western epistemological order would in turn produce the classificatory systems whereby Black people would be, right, as she mentioned at the very beginning of the piece, fixed, right, into certain prescriptive roles. And it would take significant work to unfix us from the roles inside of that governing text, right? Now, the issue is, right, the rise of the West itself occurred by way of its contact with the New World outside of Europe in the Americas, right? And the idea of order itself was also being negotiated inside, right, of that process of colonial domination, right? And so what happens, according to Wynter, is that the deepest levels of human cognition, right, is where this governing text was perfected and the relation, right, between those of us fixed inside of this order and those who are able to move around with a little bit more latitude inside of this order was made possible, right? Now back to Fanon's statement, right, that beside phylogeny and ontogeny stands sociogeny. She says every discipline you're practicing ceases to exist after Fanon has said that, right? And the reason she says this is because she believes that she is not an eventist thinker, as it were, but she does not discount the role of the event, right, in historical conjunctures that get us to where we are now, right? And for Wynter, there are three major ones, right? The first being the Copernican, right? Copernicus stating the Earth also moves, right? For her, this is one of those moments where even if we wanted to return to a place, right, where we thought that everything revolved around that, we couldn't. Even if we did our very, very best to, we simply could not undo that rupture intellectually, despite anybody's best efforts, right? So the Copernican, right? The next, according to Wynter, is the Darwinian, right? Which is what? Which is essentially the, argument that he presents in The Descent of Man, in which, the humans as a species, first of all, being a species, and second, that humans are not created in the perfect image, right, of the, overarching Judeo-Christian understanding of God, that there was no Adamic fall, but in fact, right, humans as a species emerged here on Earth alongside the rest of the Earth inside of a natural process, right, of what he calls natural selection. And she adds to this what is kind of the underside of that logic is that if there is a process of natural selection, then there are always those that have been naturally deselected inside of that process, right? And so, right, now, even if we wanted to, we couldn't really go back to thinking that there isn't something biological about being human, right? Even if we hold fast to certain creation stories, which are important organizing principles for many, many people's sacred worlds, there would still be a difficulty in returning to a place where we would liquidate the idea entirely that there is something biological about being human, right? And that biological presence itself has a moral and a value-based logic baked into it, that being natural selection and natural deselection. She says that there is a third unfinished event, as it were. For her, it's the Fenonian event, the third event, right? Which was launched by Fanon saying that besides phylogeny and ontogeny is sociogeny in black skin, white masks, right? And the reason why for Wynter that is so significant, right, is because it's in that moment in black skin, white masks, right, that Fanon he is committing a kind of annihilatory project against his own discipline as a medical doctor, right? At a time in which it was understood as medical orthodoxy that race was biological, right? That it is biological, it is not something, right, that can be altered or changed or, right, unfixed or fixed in any way, right? But Fanon, via his studies, right, began to realize, right, that sure, there is something biological-ish, right, about race, but, right, equally significant is culture and language, right? That we are both culture and biology at the same time together, that one doesn't necessarily precede the other, right? And he shows this in a few ways, right? In that first chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, he shows it by that description where he says that, when you are an Antillean in France, when you speak really, really excellent French, when someone describes you in your absence, you're actually described as looking whiter than you actually are because of your command of the French language. And so he says, so I know, right, that phenotypically, in terms of like the material fleshly part of being human, it is incredibly alterable, right, by the invocation of language in certain ways, right? There's also that famous scene on the train, right, where he encounters the child who says, "Look, mama, a Negro," and he begins to, right, violently vomit and sweat, right? He's having a physiological reaction, right, to somebody wielding language in a particular way, right? So he says, now I'm a medical doctor. And so I know how the body works, and I'm telling you, right, that yes, language can actually change the like material stuff, right, of our biology and the way we appear in this world, while also not discounting that there is something biological that is present. But the relationship between the two is something, right, that remained unexplored by others in his medical community, right? He passed before he could necessarily kind of finish that thought to its completion. But for Wynter, this is the third event, right? The third event is this Fenonian rupture in which the way out of our predicaments, being man's overrepresentation, the annihilation of the planet and its lifespan, and a host of other things, right? The way out might actually be made possible via this new approach of sociogeny, right? Where we can stick and move between language and biology in a way that produces a different outcome, right? That might get us to a rupture so profound, right? That every discipline we're practicing ceases to exist, right? A rupture so profound that, like Copernicus, we might not be able to unthink the rupture once it happens, right? And so part of this third event are many, many, many different kind of experiments, right, in refusing these profound negations, in refusing the governing text of Western episteme, right? One part of it being Black studies, right? And so, like she says, there was a brief moment in the 1960s where the kind of one part of this intellectual revolution might have been completed, right, because of the dovetailing, right, of global Black power movement, Black arts, Black aesthetics, and of course, Black studies, all happening within this very short period of time, just like a feverish moment, right, of radical energy. Right. And again, she calls these the initially penetrating insights that called into question what she called the global world system and the nature of the quote absently present framework which mandated all of their and our respective subjections. Right. And she says, quote, within this brief hiatus, the disciplinary apparatus and its boundaries would challenge the range of anti-colonial and other intellectual movements, right? Before these movements were re-co-opted, right? And as Wynter shows, right, these insights presented what would ultimately be their failure in what she calls, quote, the wake of their politically activist phase to complete intellectually that emancipation, right? So she says the active phase, right, of those initial insights did what they needed to do. The failure was on the part to complete that emancipation at the intellectual level, right? And so what does this mean? Well, right, it means that, let me just skip over this since I'm realizing we only have an hour, right? Skip that too, right? It means that given the role, right, of what she calls this archipelago of human otherness that especially Black people have been condemned to, right? Or as she also calls it, quote unquote, defective otherness, right? That is, as she says, analogically imposed upon peoples and countries of Africa and the Black diaspora by a representational apparatus of our Western world system, right? For her, right, the key, right, to undoing this unbearable situation of being desetra, of wrongness of being, right, is to complete the Fenonian rupture. And the completion of this Fenonian rupture would unburden us of, right, man masquerading as the human. It would unburden us, right, of the governing texts and, the culture-specific truths that accompany these governing texts about who we are as Black people. And it would get us to a place in which we might actually, one, refute again these profound negations that are imposed by, right, the Middle Passage and the New World economies, and two, right, might get us to an understanding of a human configuration for the very first time since the presence of man, right, has enclosed any possibility of achieving an understanding of a human configuration, right? So she says all of this is what's at stake when we make a real attempt, a running head first attempt, right, at the third event, right? So what's another way that we can talk about this? Well, I think Sylvia's interviews give us some of the best ways to understand what it is she means when she says what she says, right? Because I like to think of her interviews not unlike Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, which is also one of her favorite novels of all time, right? And if any of you have read The Bluest Eye, you'll know that what's so unusual about it is that Morrison, she starts with the end of the story. Like on that first page, she gives away the plot. They lived in this house, and this is what happened to, Pecola Breedlove, and this is, what their life was like. She gives away the whole plot, right? So that we can then get to the actual story itself, right? So that we're not so hung up on the who, what, when, where, why, right? She gets it out of the way so that we can then really delve into, right, language, how this story is made possible, right? What the stakes are for all of the players, for everybody involved, right? And she does this same thing in her interviews, right? So, for example, in her interview with Catherine McKittrick, Unparalleled Catastrophe for a Species, right, she starts by saying, what's the problem? Well, the problem is man's overrepresentation, right? Man masquerading as the human, right? We think we have an understanding of the human, but we really had man one being Christian man, we had man two being Homo economicus, right? We've never really achieved a true, what she calls ecumenical politics of the propter nos hominis, essentially meaning, right, a non-hierarchical we experience in which we have a full and capacious understanding of the human for the very first time, right? And so, right, what has this problem of man's overrepresentation, man masquerading as the human, the profound negations of the Middle Passage imposed upon Black life, what has it produced? Well, it's produced a profound alienation, right? And she cites heavily, Du Bois' double consciousness, Fanon's zone of non-being, and I added to it, right, the lonely child at the center of Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, right? And so she says, well, it's not all lost, right? It's not all lost because when we begin to understand, right, how biology and culture work together, right, how what she calls the bios and the mythos work together, right, we can then begin to place ourselves inside of these mechanics, right? But we would first have to betray the fact that those mechanics are there and that they matter. And second, we would have to, right, assess them carefully enough so that we can, therefore, right, disentangle and see where we fall inside of that logic, right? And so, right, for Wynter, right, she says that there are, right, two sets of instructions, right, that, as she calls it, self-institute law likely via a process of autopoiesis. I'm going to get to this later, right? Right. But so far we know that we have biology and culture working together at the same time, coevally. And she says, as people, as human beings, our bodies can never perceive the stories that we tell about those bodies, right? So this is the relationship that she's identified, right? Using Fanon's statement about sociogeny, right? And, right, she then once again says, what I'm going to propose, quote, what I'm going to propose is that we are now challenged with envisioning, right, a new science of the word, which I take from Aimé Césaire. This challenge can be likened to that made by Copernicus when declared that while it may seem absurd, the earth indeed also moves, right? Then Galileo tried to support this view and he was imprisoned by the Inquisition and had to recant specifically that the earth indeed does move. Yet, of course, the earth does move, right? So now we have a few things that play a role in this third event, right? One, the most important, is that it's initiated by Fanon's sociogenic statement. Two, that included in this third event would have to be a kind of intellectual revolution, maybe Black studies, right? Second, right, it would have to, right, invoke a kind of way of using language that is on the one hand novel, but at the same time connected to what's already been there. Science of the Word by Césaire. So she's building out now a strategy, right? It would also have to include something that's hidden in this statement by Copernicus, right? Galileo and Copernicus, right, were persecuted as being heretic, right? Not necessarily for spreading falsehoods, but for being heretic. So we also know that in addition to those things is that, right, this third event will be made possible by, on multiple occasions, the launching of heretic statements against, right, these culture-specific truths that uphold the governing text about who is human, right, who is inside of this archipelago of human otherness, who we are as Black people, right? So she's building out a strategy slowly, right, for this third event. All right. Now, right. And then she says, the point is that we must now collectively undertake a rewriting of knowledge as we know it, right? This is a rewriting in which, inter alia, I want the West to recognize the dimensions of what it has brought into the world. This with respect to, inter alia, our now purely naturalized modes or genres of humanness, you see, because the West did change the world, totally. And I want to suggest that it is that change that has now made our own proposed far-reaching changes, now as imperative as they are inevitable. As Einstein said, once physical scientists had split the atom, if we continue our old way of thinking, the pre-nuclear way of thinking, we drift as a species toward an unparalleled catastrophe, right? So she's saying that there's a pre-nuclear way of thinking, and she's just kind of using this in a apocalyptic sense, right? Right. And she says, there comes a point at which these ruptures must be introduced, or else it will mean significant consequences for those of us who are already the damnés, right? Right. And so, right, now we can see why, right? She's making Black studies so central inside of this project. She really does believe that this is a intellectual revolution, right? That this is a rewriting of knowledge, right? But for her, an intellectual can be a lay intellectual, can be a formal intellectual, it can be a kind of heretic artist, it can be all kinds of people, right? But the fact is that there is an intellectual project and task that's central, right? Which is why, on the one hand, she kind of laments, right, the defanging of Black studies. But the fact that she's lamenting it means that she valued it in the first place, that she saw its potential, and that she's trying to remind people of what that potential was, right? And so let's continue here, right? So there was a paleontologist named Juan Luis Arzuaga, right, who proposed, right, that the human is not only a languaging being, but also a storytelling species. These are Wynter's words. She continues, in my own terms, the human is Homo nerens. That means as a species, our hybrid origins only emerged, right, in the wake of what I've come to define over the last decade as the third event, right? The third event is defined by the singularity of the coevolution of the human brain with, and unlike those of all other primates, with it alone are the emergent faculties of language storytelling. This coevolution must be understood concomitantly with the uniquely myth-making region of the human brain, as the brain scientists Andrew Newberg, Eugene Keeley, and Vince Rouse document, right? Now, she continues, if you look at living systems such as the beehive, right, they are purely biological eusocial systems. Our human eusocial systems are instead hybrid language income storytelling, right, living systems, but they function according to laws analogous to those regulatory laws of the supra-autopoietic system, which is the beehive. The beehive, right, is the example, is the kind of controlling metaphor that she's using to describe those two sets of instructions that I mentioned at the beginning. I told you I was going to come back to it, right? So essentially, right, she says that there are no mechanisms in place for the bees to conceive of themselves outside of the beehive, which contains them, right? She says what makes humans different as a species, right, is that betrayal is made possible via the way language, right, is, right, coeval with our biological evolution and the way it is wired to what is called the myth-making part of our brain, right? Okay, so what does this mean? Well, she says, essentially, right, as a species, as humans, we have two sets of instructions. The first being kind of metabolic. I'm hungry, I must eat, I'm thirsty, I must drink, it's hot, let me seek shade, right? These kind of metabolic switch, right? That kind of levers on and off, right? But there's also a second set of instructions, right? And that second set of instructions, right, is, in her estimation, right, it is, it supersedes that first set of instructions on occasion, right? And why is that? Well, right, she says that the second set of instructions interprets the world of language. It determines how we move about inside of our environment, right? And she says, with any living organism, right, genetic information reproduces itself law-likely over time, again and again and again, right? She says, once in a while, right? And again, she's like drawing from her studies of Darwin and etc. Once in a while, like a mutation is introduced, right, into the frame. But she says that the mutation is never ever introduced at the level of the first set of instructions. It's not as if the hunger cue suddenly decides to no longer be a hunger cue and then it decides to be a laughter cue or something, right? No. The mutation is almost always introduced at the level of the second set of instructions. There's a change in the environment. A new species is introduced into the community, right? Maybe there's a drought. Maybe, right, humans have moved on to the territory, right? And it's those changes in the external world, in the environment, in the second set of instructions that then leads to a change in the physical properties of the species, right? So essentially, she's saying there is evidence empirically for Fanon's sociogenic statement, right? That we are a flesh that's made possible by a world of languages and symbols, right? And that in order to, right, introduce these ruptures, it can only happen by introducing it at the level, right, of these social structures. We can't go one by one and change the organism, each organism, and then assume that it's going to produce a profound shift in the way we live our lives. She says, even at the smallest organism, it does not work that way. So why would we assume that we're any different, right? So the process of when things are reproduced over and over and over and over again, law likely, but are vulnerable, right, to these changes and alterations in the environment, this process she calls autopoiesis, right? So she says we might seem like we're trapped inside of this governing text and beholden to these culture-specific truths that are upholding this governing text. But society and even biology at the smallest, most kind of granular level is legion with examples of how introducing one small but right targeted and appropriately introduced alteration can mutate the entire species and set forth on a new path, right? And so for Wynter, now also part of this new event, this third event, in addition to the sociogenic statement, right, the intellectual revolution made possible, right, on one hand by Black studies, right, harnessing, right, poiesis language in new and profound ways, the science of the word. Added to it now, right, is this idea that we are hybridly human, right, that we are words made flesh, right, by a process of autopoiesis, right, in which we reproduce ourselves over and over and over again until and unless a heretic like Copernicus, like Darwin, like Fanon, right, like chopping down a poisonous tree in the environment, right, until something heretic is launched against the system in which it's tripped and mutation is introduced and it's set forth again on a different path, right? So she's building out the third event as a kind of constellation of strategies, right? Based on an understanding of what the problem is, right? Man's overrepresentation, right? All of those things, all the bad things, right? And also based on an understanding that in order to grasp this, you would have to accept, right, that we are biology and culture at the same time. We are hybridly human. We are words made flesh, right? That Fanon was right about that, right? And equally, right, she says, I'm gonna make a prediction. She says, if this third event goes the way we would hope it goes, it would get us to an understanding of the human, as it were, for the very first time. And she says, I'm going to make a prediction that if we get there and we get an understanding of the human for the very first time, we are going to learn that the only thing that makes humans humans is the fact that we're a storytelling species. She said, all of this is to get us to a place in which we have a real understanding of the human, right? That is, as Césaire says, made to the measure of the world, right? Rather than making a measure of the human and then conscripting the world into it, which is what, European and Western humanism has done, right? And she says, that's what I'm gonna hang my hat, right, on that prediction. She says, and it's not actually a prediction. It's actually based on an understanding that if you go to the oldest kind of, archaeological evidence of human settlement in Blombo's cave in what is now Namibia in the southern part of Africa, right? You can see, right, that these are people that did not necessarily have a recorded speech language, right? But if you look at their cave drawings, it consists of descriptions of how they lived their lives. Yeah, she says the earliest humans that we can trace archaeologically on this planet, we're telling stories about who they are. We don't know anything else about them except that they were documenting stories about who they are. Right? And she says ultimately, the third event is a way to change the story, this origin story about who we are as humans, right? And to get a human configuration, right, in which everybody can be accounted for the very first time, right? So the third event itself, it has to be a harnessing of all of these techniques and strategies at the same time, a harnessing of the science of the word, of sociogeny, of Black studies, of, heretic statements. And it's not like every heretic statement launched against the governing, right, text is going to make the thing fall apart. No. The point is to continue endeavoring and trying. And at some point, something, right, will rupture it. Copernicus was not the only person in the scientific community thinking along the lines that he did, but there was something penetrating, like the word she used about Black studies, about his insight that made it possible to expose certain contradictions and open up the paradigm in such a way that it could not be repaired, right? It's like having pre-nuclear and nuclear ways of thinking, completely and totally altered permanently, right? And she does that not by kind of trying to think about endeavoring like this great leap in the way that Fanon does, but really for her, the return is the break, the return to Blombo's cave. She says it's not actually anything novel or new. I'm actually gathering everything I have at my disposal that's been done by intellectuals over the years in many, many, many different fields of study, right? To arrive at a conclusion that I think I'm, pretty happy with. And she likes to say, she's like, and I think I'm right. I think she's right too, right? So what does this all mean, right? In an interview that I did with her, she says a few things, right? One thing she says is, I don't know, I'm gonna skip out a lot of things. I had so many notes here. It's very ambitious for this 1 hour, right? Oh, here it is. Okay, so she says, right? And this is an interview I did with her. She says, quote, well, you see, I began reading about the Kingdom of the Congo and initiation ceremonies, rites of passage. In particular, I learned that what we might do better is to refer to education as initiation, particularly, right, as Africans, because in these societies in the Kingdom of Congo, education consisted of an initiation process into a master script containing the truths of that society. And when the community felt under threat, it used these initiation ceremonies with children in order to reinforce its self-conception. And then I ask her, so is it sort of like a recreation of its own beginning or staging a new drama concerning its origins? And then she says, quote, yes. And you see what happens is that what once was there must die in order for the initiation to occur and entry into the new life. It is a birth through death, right? And what is important are the ceremonies that occur in order for this transformation to take place. They are ceremonies structured entirely by language and art. The third event is so important because it is one that relies totally and completely on language to get us there. And in this country, we must begin to think about education as an initiation into a world full of symbols and descriptions about who we are, right? Thinking of it as initiation helps us to understand the importance, right, of introducing something else into the lives and worlds of children, right? We need to reinitiate ourselves, a symbolic life through death, and create ourselves anew, right? So this was 2021, right? So between 2014 and 2021, right, where is the time between those two interviews that I've been quoting from, right? So essentially she's saying that the third event is an initiation. Think of it in a kind of sacred way, an initiation. Your old self has to be left behind. What was there must die, right? In order for this new thing, right, to emerge. And it's structured by ceremonies, right? I always tell people, I'm like, the ceremony that must be found, it's the third event, right? It's the third event, right? And it relies, as she says, totally on language to get it there. We will use what materials at our disposal, but essentially, how we invoke it, what language we use, what symbols we use, will determine what the outcome is, right? And, right, she says, right, where the third event becomes so important is because it is a recognition that we are a species, but not in the manner we've been accustomed to, right? That we can narrate this problem in a different way, right? Oh, sorry. I'm like, I zoomed in entirely too much on my notes. Apologies. Right? And then she says, right? You've noticed something important. You see, part of what we need to do is to grapple with Africa itself, because we all, as Black people, originated from Africa. Um, it does not mean, right, that we are all invested in being Black people, because we do have variations according to region, et cetera, and so forth, right? Right. Where Africa as our origin becomes important is in recognizing that if we are going to tell a different story of ourselves, we must grapple with the beginnings, in which Africa is not only important, but the key. They want us to think about Africa as a way to think about affliction, but it is Africa that gave the entire world its language systems, gave us all of what has been transformed over time and continues, of course, into the present. And so you see, you cannot have a third event without Africa right at the middle. Because how do you tell the story differently if the beginning hasn't been grappled with? How can you have a third event without Africa, which has given the world its character, playing a central role in claiming our past, present, and future selves? I think this is very important, right? So again, there's a way that even though these interviews are years and years apart, she is emphasizing certain things, right? That yes, her kind of scholastic work around autopoiesis and Fanon and the science of the word, etc., it's not there to authorize itself, right? She only does that to add texture to what the real authorizing, right, intellectual contribution is that she has, which is she says that she's always been studying life in the Congo. She's always been studying, right, how Africa has been at the very center of everything we do, right? And she also says that for her, the core question is not who is or who isn't human. Her core question is, who are we as Black people? Who are we? And she thinks that the human has something to do, right, with some of the ways that that question, right, is offered a response, right? But it's not the whole point. The point is, who are we as Black people? How do we get ourselves out of this thing, right? And for her, she says, there's many approaches. Cognitive science, autopoiesis, which is like plant biology, right? Fanon, right? Which is kind of existential philosophy, if you want to call it that, right? These kind of heretic artistic statements, right? All kinds of things, poetry, medicine, everything, right? But she says, all of this, yes, but it all offers us a break, which is a return to what we've already known as Black people and as Africans, right? Which is the only way to get to somewhere else is to shed what you're carrying, right? The only way, right, is to have everybody participate in something in which everyone loses something, right, and is initiated into something, right? You have to have a ceremony to bury what's dead, right? And inhabit that new living thing that you're committed to. And you have to have systems in place to, on the one hand, protect that thing that you've worked, right, to diffuse, while on the other hand, right, recognize that at any moment it is vulnerable to a heretic break, to mutation, right? And so, in a way, the third event is the thing that we're reaching for, but it's also a return to a way of thinking about things, right, that acknowledges that that vulnerability is there, that at everywhere you go is an opportunity for an opening onto something else, everywhere, right? And that's actually what keeps our thinking rigorous. So the third event is not simply a response to what do we do about the human and Black people, it's also a way of recognizing, right, that if we take our eye off the ball for even 1 second, right, we will mistake the map for the territory. We will re-territorialize ourselves, right, in this predicament, and we will have to do that thing again and again and again, right? And so that is my best way of describing what the third event is, according to Wynter. And so with that, I'll open it up for some questions. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for that. Folks are going to get something. You already getting your ashes in the chat, and you can get some love, uh, Dr. Allegra, and
Oh,
in
please
kind
don't call me that.
of okay.
It's really,
All right, all right, all right.
please just call me by my name, comrade. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, comrade. Well, I usually have to pull questions, but there are 5 questions in the chat waiting for you already.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see them, and if you want to pick the one there's so many,
Okay.
all of
Oh,
them rich
okay.
paths to follow.
Wow. Okay. Wow. I was also not expecting so many questions. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just focus here. Okay. Wait. Where are the questions? It's in the chat, you said?
You see a question and answer button at the bottom of your.
Oh, well, I've been using Zoom for 5 years straight and I'm still like
Same.
it's my first day on planet Earth. I'm
Right.
so sorry, everyone.
It's
Um, how does Witcher's assessment of the failure of humanism relate to the Marxist tradition? Fanon is a result of his stretched Marxism. I'm detecting a radical sociology, but I'm not sure how this interfaces with the politics of Marxism, anti-colonialism specifically. I'll go as far as to ask Winter, like her. Yeah. So, Winter's relationship to Marxism is long and winding and complex, and she's still very much committed to a kind of Marxist ideology. Um, a few things, right? So sociogeny is developed in black skin, white masks, right? And he doesn't necessarily develop his idea of stretching Marxism until, well, he doesn't make that declaration outright until The Wretched of the Earth, which is 6, 7 years after Black Skin, White Masks. And so it's something that he's also working through because even inside of Black Skin, White Masks, he has a deep and antagonistic relationship to history itself, right? He thinks that, that in fact, you must liquidate the past in order to be able to liberate yourself from the predicament. And he says that he says in the conclusion, he says, I'm not a prisoner of history. He's like, I'm resolutely a man of my time, right? And he quotes from Marx's 18th Brumaire, right? That the revolution cannot borrow from the poetry of the past, right? In the introduction to the final chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, right? And then later in The Wretched of the Earth, he develops that beautiful dictum. He says that the base is the superstructure. You're white because you're rich because you're white. This is why, in the colonial situation, Marxism must be stretched, right? And what's interesting is that in the interview that I did with her, I'm actually just going to pull it up so that I can read from it directly. Um, there it is, right? So the very first question that I ask her is about an interview that she did with David Scott, right, in which she said that we should not go for what she called cheap and easy radicalisms. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Right? And so her response is this. She said, quote, you see, when I was speaking of this previously, I was referring to the experience I had while living in Guyana, as you know. What I witnessed there, the failure of the Marxist project in Guyana in bringing about the transformation which would cut across the Black-Indian divide, gave me much to think about concerning our problems. Yes, we had supported the Marxists. And we realized very quickly that the state solution given by the Marxists was not sufficient because of the prevalence of race, that the work needed to occur elsewhere aside from the state. When Jan and I left Guyana and returned to Jamaica, we kept this in our minds. We had to take the work of transforming the society elsewhere into a different arena totally. And that's where you have the Jamaica Journal beginning. It was a way to retell the past and the present at the same time. You see, it had belonged to the former masters, and we, being former slaves, took it over totally. We were able to forego that cheap and easy radicalism of simply organizing the state differently, and we began to tell different origin stories of who we were as Black people and as Africans. It was the creative side and the creative working of things which led us to the difference in making claims about who we are. The cheap and easy radicalism does not address the underlying requirement for a total transformation. Who are we as Black people? Who are we as Africans? The Marxists, and actually no party could give us that. Only we could do it, right? The hard way is to reclaim our past, present, and future selves totally, right? So for Winter, right, Marxism, according to her, is necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? She says, clearly, just organizing the state differently is not sufficient, right? To cut across this thing called race, which, right, is older than the state, right? Which is older than the New World, but also made in the New World at the same time, right? She says it's going to require something, right, more operating at the level of the symbolic world, since that seems to cut across institutional transformations, right? And so, hold on, I need to see what the rest of the question was, just because my memory isn't great. Um, yeah, so she would call herself an anti-colonial, committed to an anti-colonial politic, right? She would say that she's a student of Marx and that she is a proponent of certain Marxist or Marxian, right, paradigms, but she would never call those things sufficient on their own, right? She's somebody who, as you can see, pulling from cognitive science, she will pull from whatever is at her disposal to get right to what it is she thinks is the rupture that's required. And Marxism is part of it, but in Black Metamorphosis, you'll see when it comes out that she very much like kind of kills the father, so to speak, as far as Marx goes. She says, well, keep certain things, but there are certain things that, as Derek Walcott says, those who break a tradition first hold it in awe. And I think there are ways in which she has like exceeded the frame. But also you can only exceed the frame if you've exhausted a frame by studying it in the first place, right? So she was only able to get there by studying Marx. Hopefully that answers. Um, about the meaning of the text when Winter talks about the governing text. Oh, yes. So in terms of the governing text, so Sylvia is a dramaturge, so she was an actor and dancer, but she also was a playwright, a fantastic playwright. And so she uses a lot of dramaturgical language to talk about how our ways of being in the world are scripted for us in ways that are conscious and also not always conscious, right? And so for her, the governing text are, right, the idea that man is biological, that man is Homo economicus, right? That Western episteme has certain founding principles, right? All of these things are part of our governing text, right? And the governing text is like a script and it tells us how we act and in what ways we act, right? And so some literal texts are included in it, like the Bible, right? For man one, right? There are literal texts that are included in it, but it's more so a way of seeing the way that certain logics are written onto our lives in ways that are mostly not conscious. Sometimes we betray those logics, but most of the time we're not. So it's not like a physical, actual one text, but a set of logics that operate like scripture in determining how we behave in the world. So that's a great question. Yeah. Curious about the second instruction whereby we are changed by the environment. What is the relationship between our environment and language? Are the changes in the environment that can create a break, a third event always produced through language? Are the factors in the environment that can change us always shaped by language for us? Yes. So her argument is that for humans, right, the only way that an environment even exists is because we've developed a lexicon and a language to call things as they are, right? And so the fact that we call something like freedom, it only means something because we call it freedom. And we could introduce something else under different language tomorrow, and suddenly our priorities might change, and how we think of ourselves as like a freedom-seeking or loving species might completely change as a result, right? So she says that for like plant-based organisms, which is where she gets the autopoiesis from, she says it's by a rupture in the physical environment because plants don't necessarily harness language the way that we do. So like, you know, someone cuts down the Amazon. I don't know, they like empty out the river and it's like a drought or something. And so then that would introduce like an alteration or mutation at the level of the metabolic, which is the first set of instructions. So for humans, right, it's the introduction of a language-based thing, right, that then alters the first set of instructions. So for example, like Fanon, right, he's in that train, he's fine. He's like walking around, right? But it's when he encounters that child saying, "Look, Mama, a Negro," and it's his first time being called that, like outright to his face, right? That then his first set of instructions, his metabolic, like he starts to vomit, he starts to like sweat, he feels like he's got an out-of-body experience, like he's gonna faint or pass out or something, right? So that's kind of the relationship that she's trying to establish. She's like, that's how significant, that's how it is for humans. It's actually language that introduces those like profound changes in the outside worlds, right? Like if a law is written onto the books that suddenly criminalizes homelessness and suddenly all kinds of unsheltered people physically freeze to their deaths because of it, that's an imposition of language. Like if nobody sat and developed, right, a grammar under which that even makes sense in the first place, then those people would physically not be punished in such a way, right? So this is how significant the role of language is in altering our like like existential, our like metaphysics, and also our physical presence, you know? So hopefully that also clarifies things a little bit. These are great questions. I might need to
All
write these
right.
down.
Z is giving us the
Oh, okay, sorry.
yes, yes.
We're
We
over. I'm
gotta get, yeah, we have to get
so
ready.
sorry.
Absolutely. No, this was a great conversation. Again, want to offer folks an opportunity to give some love in the chat. I know there was so much more. I wanted to hear about the rupture of racial capitalism and then what more, but I think folks can be on the lookout for the book Metamorphosis and your other pieces of work. And then also go to your website if they want to read more. So again, want to
If you want to read that really long bio
you
that
want to read
Comrade
the rest of
Jomo
the bio,
was
yes.
burdened with reading, I'm so sorry.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so there's calls for more, more, more. So again, thank you so much. Continue to pour love in for our comrade in the chat and Z.
Thank y'all for having me.
Yes.
Also, if one of you can send me the info for this winter reading group, please send me the info. I would love to come if you're open to guests, like to hang out. If not, that's also fine. Okay, sorry,
Oh,
continue.
wow, the a premier academia on Civil Winters wants to hang with you all.
They probably don't want me to hang anyway, so it's fine. It's fine. But thank you for having me. I'm honestly so this was great. Thank
Oh,
you.
they would love to have you. All right. Thank you again. And we want to, before we close, tell you what we're happy because we have something happening tomorrow as well.
Free to land, y'all. We are going to be joined by Dr. Ashley Farmer tomorrow for an event. She's going to be discussing our great mother, Queen Mother Audley Moore. And we just also want to just give a huge thanks to Dr. Alagraa. This was fantastic. As you can see, like literally the chat is on fire. The questions were fire. And we're waiting for that book. So, like, get that to us, okay? Because we need to have you back for an event on your book. So, we're really excited about that. But what we're going to do now is we're going to transition to our classes.